Hey everybody, welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these. So welcome back everybody. You had a lot of great questions today, and I'm going to do what I can with them, with 3 of them this time. I hope. I might only get to 2 of them. But you're asking very good questions. We are at a crisis moment in American history. So I want people to be aware of that. I certainly will talk about these issues, and I hope talk about them in ways you can really get your mind around and your teeth around. But even though I really try and present material calmly, as you know, this is not normal. We're not in an okay place in America right now. And I think I'll manage to talk a little bit about that and what that looks like and what we might do to try and get us back to a more normal place. All right, so let's start here with the obvious question. And it's a question that comes from Robin Jones, who says, why doesn't Congress include Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, in the Posse Comitatus Act? And wouldn't that then end the assault on Portland, Oregon, Chicago, and in places like Washington, D.C.'s Lafayette Square? This obviously is the question of the hour, right? Like, what is going on? There's a number of things going on right now, and I'm going to spend maybe more time on it than you would like to know. But what is essentially at heart going on is the question of the role of force in our government. That is, we have a military, and that military has a number of branches, and those branches are prohibited under, they're prohibited except under cases of emergency, which I'm not going to talk about today. I have talked about them in the past. They're prohibited from using their force against American citizens, and that's what Robin means by the Posse Comitatus Act. That was an act that passed Congress in 1878 that forbade the use of the military against Americans domestically in the wake of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, when, in fact, the president, Rutherford B. Hayes, called out federal troops to put down strikes against the Thomas A. Scott's railroad. And the use of the military to back up an industrialist who was having labor issues was a real overreach, Democrats thought, so they backed a law that said that couldn't happen. Now, that law in 1878 only covered the U.S. Army, but since then, all the other branches of the military have said that they consider themselves bound by the Posse Comitatus Act. And one of the things that I like to talk about when I talk about the use of force and the military is that it's worth remembering. Now, a lot of you may have good attitudes about the American military or bad attitudes about the American military. You might like them or you might not like them. But historically, they've been around for a very long time. And when you have an organization that's been around for a long time, it tends to have a lot of traditions, and it tends to be fairly tightly wrapped, that it behaves in certain ways that are that are an institutional loyalty, and because of that institutional loyalty, there are things that the military is less likely to do because they are bound by these traditions and by their mottos and by a really tight adherence to the rule of law as well. Now, again, I'm sure people are sitting there going, well, wait a minute, what about this? What about the My Lai massacre? What about the Wounded Knee massacre? What about all those things? Yes. But I'm setting up something here. They are more tightly bound by tradition and by rules than the new Department of Homeland Security that I'm going to talk about. So it's worth remembering that, first of all. And this is one of the reasons that the military leaders were so upset when President Trump pardoned the Navy SEAL who had pretty clearly broken military law. And the reason for that is that they really tightly adhere to all the stages of military law, because the last thing you want when you have, and I'm talking generally here, when you have a leader in charge of life or death, which is what a military person has, you don't want that person taking shortcuts. because you really do need to know that they are bound by rules, because if they're not, it's a pretty short step to a leader who's dangerous to everyone. All right. So if that's the military, why am I spending so much time on the military? Because something really important happened after June 1st when Donald Trump, Donald Trump, but Attorney General William Barr issued the orders to members of law enforcement that were operating in Washington, D.C. You can tell I'm being careful with my words here. To clear the square, Lafayette Square, of protesters, of peaceful protesters using tear gas, flashbangs, and force. And what happened then, if you remember, was that Trump walked across the square to a church and held up a Bible, and it was a photo op. And with him went the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man named Mark Milley. And he was wearing fatigues, and he had been ordered by Trump, not ordered. He had been, Trump had gotten him to, as an advisor. He's not part of the military chain of command as parts of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Trump had him in the streets basically for photo ops. Well, after he did that and showed up walking alongside Trump in that walk that day to the church and back, Milley apologized for that, which was a very odd thing. Not odd, it was a very striking thing to begin with. But for the next week or 10 days, if you remember, a really wide range of military leaders, both present and past, came out and said, we believe in the Constitution. We do not believe in the use of American military personnel against other Americans who are exercising their constitutional rights. And of course, by our Constitution, Americans have the right to protest, to peacefully protest. But in the case of what was happening in Lafayette Square and certainly what's been happening in Portland, Oregon, local officials believe that they have things under control there. That is, certainly in Portland, Oregon, the vandalism that's going on, for example, is pretty low-level stuff if you think about what could be happening. So the military gets it's pretty clear on June 1st that Trump is trying to co-opt the military to support him. And the military pushes back really fast and really hard. I mean, if you remember in the letters, I wrote about this again and again, because it was basically the military saying, nope, we're not going there. If you're going to do this, you're going to do it without us. And that's, and they hit again and again and again on the idea of the Constitution and how they stood on the Constitution, to which, of course, they swore an oath, and it is, of course, the foundation of our government. Theoretically, we are not loyal to people, we are loyal to our laws, and our laws are established by our Constitution. So the military not walked away, but backed away and put a really clear wall up there. And they also talked at that time, if you recall, about getting rid of the Confederate flag on certain military installations. A number of different leaders did. And last Friday, the Pentagon has said that you can't have the Confederate flag on any military property displayed, even including in barracks or in common areas. There are a number of flags you can have, but you can't have that Confederate flag. And what they're talking about there is they're talking about the need for making sure that the military is inclusive. It's also an issue that there's an issue in the fact that about 40% of our military personnel are people of color, who of course don't like seeing the Confederate flag around because it does represent human enslavement. And it does represent now, under the Trump administration, a political organization that is quite openly racist. And one of the things I've written about a lot, but I'm not one of the scholars primarily who's out in front on this, is the increasing use from the Donald Trump campaign of neo-Nazi symbolism. And it's pretty clear. To historians, it's really pretty clear. And most importantly, even if you're not seeing it, it's very clear to neo-Nazis because they see their symbolism, they see their signs and being distributed by the campaign of the President of the United States, and it gives them a sense that this is the direction that the country is going. All right. So I set all that up because what I just tried to do was take out of the discussion about what's happening right now in American government, to take out the military, because our military has been really clear saying, we're not playing this game. We don't want any part of this. So what is going on? What is going on is that, as you know, there are three branches of the American government: the legislative, and that's Congress; the judicial, and that's the courts and the Supreme Court; and then finally the executive branch. And the executive branch is not simply the president, but it is a very large, hundreds of thousands of employees branch of government that is overseen by the president. And that includes the Department of Justice, who now has at its helm Attorney General William Barr, who is a real loyalist to Donald Trump. Now, by the way, I want to emphasize here that the Attorney General is not the president's lawyer, either in an official capacity, that would be the White House counsel, or in a personal capacity, and those would be Donald Trump's personal lawyers. The Attorney General is supposed to be the attorney for the American people, to defend the American law and to defend our legal system. Obviously, that's not what's happening under Attorney General William Barr. All right, so why do they matter right now in this law enforcement, in what's going on with law enforcement? Because under the executive branch, the executive branch actually has a really funny patchwork of law enforcement officials. People from the FBI, but also things like police for the fisheries. I mean, funny. Many departments that are in the under the executive branch have one kind or another of law enforcement capabilities. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Off the top of my head, of course, I'm not coming up with a lot of them, but you can probably think of things that are under the executive branch rather than being part of the military. And what matters is that the Trump administration, no longer being able to hope that the military is going to support them, have turned to those officers in the executive branch to support what Attorney General William Barr and what Donald Trump want to do. And now let's unpack that a little bit. So what does this mean? Who are these people, and what are they doing? So first of all, one of the things that I'm going to hope to pick this up after I finish talking about this law enforcement situation. One of the things that jumps out at me again and again is we're in this. I mean, aside from everything else, President Trump's obsession with being reelected is unprecedented in American history. That is, every president wants to be reelected unless they've pulled themselves out of the running the way LBJ did, or the way Teddy Roosevelt did in the second term. They all want to be reelected, but they don't want to be reelected to the point that they are literally begging, the leader of China to change trade policy to guarantee their reelection. They don't want to be reelected to the point that they are threatening one of our foreign allies, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, to say, we're going to withhold money from you unless you help us rig our election. So we're dealing right here with something that's really unusual. Why is it so imperative to Donald Trump that he must be reelected? And I worry a little bit when we don't think a lot about that, because again, what's the worst case scenario for a normal president if he, or someday she, isn't reelected? They quit. Play golf if that's what you do, or they whatever, and they make a gazillion dollars on the lecture circuit. It's not a bad gig. So why is he so obsessed with being reelected? And a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about that. I certainly have thoughts about that. I will point out that if we have under the 1973 memo from the Justice Department a standing rule, it's not a standing guideline, it's not a law, it's never been tested in court, that a sitting president cannot be indicted for crimes. And one of the things that I think is going forward here is that, as the Supreme Court decided a week or two ago, I've lost track of time, that in fact both Congress and the Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. can subpoena Donald Trump's financial information, both his taxes and his financial transactions, his and the members of his family, for a number of years going back. And the judge has fast-tracked those. So they went back to lower courts, and the Trump administration has until July 27th, I think it is, to say what their objections are to any subpoenas. But the subpoenas themselves were really very limited, so it's going to be hard for them to construct an objection to them. And it just seems to me, as a historian and as somebody who's been paying close attention to this, he would not be trying so hard to hide those financials if there weren't something big in them. So that, to me, is at least one of the reasons why he may so desperately want to be reelected. But if, in fact, he wants to be so badly reelected, and we can, I can anyway, say that, I'm sorry, somebody just pointed out that I didn't say the second half of that sentence, is that once you're no longer president, you can, in fact, be indicted. So, and that's pretty clear. So that's at least some of what's going on, I think, with his determination to say that to be reelected. But if that's the case, what is going on with the assault on Portland, Oregon, and now apparently Chicago, and probably other places as well, including Milwaukee, which itself is a really interesting city to throw in there, because nothing really is going on in Milwaukee. So there's a question about why he threw Milwaukee in that. I think you can make a good case, and I would argue that what he is trying to do is create a narrative to try and win re-election, in the place of the fact that the coronavirus is devastating America. Out of all the countries, the developed countries in the world, most of them have gotten the coronavirus under control. It is running rampant in America. There's no excuse for where we are. And his approval numbers for his handling of the coronavirus, I believe last I checked, were 33%. That in politics, that is beyond abysmal. There is no such thing as 0% in politics. There's always somebody who's on board with virtually anything for one reason or another, even if it's simply to be contrarian. So he's creating a narrative. And the other narrative that he intended to win on, of course, was the idea that the economy was strong, and he really thought that that was going to help him win. But of course, the economy has cratered because of the coronavirus. So one of the reasons that he is so adamant that we're going to get people back to work is because he's trying to make sure that the economy comes back in October, September, October, in time for the election. There's that hope for that to happen. There's also another thing that I actually plan to write about in the letters tonight, and that is that we have a real problem going forward in that the extra $600 that were appended to unemployment insurance immediately after the pandemic really took hold in America is going to run out at the end of this month. And so what we're looking at in August is a wave of huge financial hits across the country at the same time that state and local governments are trying to put together their budgets. And of course, they're strapped because they don't have any income coming in through taxation. And so they're going to have to lay people off simply because of the way state budgets and local budgets are written. You can't spend money you don't have at that level. You can at the federal level, which is why Democrats want state and local governments to get supported by the federal government until this pandemic is over. That's kind of a rabbit hole that I won't go down because I want to go back to the issue of the executive branch military. All right, so he's got this problem. He's got the economic problem. He's got the coronavirus problem. What he is apparently trying to do, and I think it's significant that, of course, he has changed his campaign chairman last Wednesday, less than a week ago, is to try and present to viewers on a screen that America is at war with an internal enemy. And the way to do that, but we're not at war with an internal enemy. Remember, in 2018, there were the migrant caravans coming across the border, and they were all going to come invade us and all that. And a lot of people really fell for that. And then the minute that the election was over, the caravans melted away, right? Well, now we've got to find ourselves an internal war, and we don't have an internal war. So one of the things that I think the administration is trying to do is present to viewers the idea that there is an internal war. So I'll get a little bit to how they're going to do this, but let me tell you about the Department of Homeland Security. And the reason I set up so much about the military and the traditions of the military is because the Department of Homeland Security does not have those. The Department of Homeland Security is an entirely different kettle of fish. And for somebody like me, a historian who studies the military, I've written a book about about the Wounded Knee Massacre. I have real respect for the military and its tradition. And I understand the needs of a military and all that sort of, historical needs of a nation to have a military. And so I don't want to say I'm a huge military booster, except I guess, I don't know how to put this, but I certainly am not a military basher either. There's good apples and there's bad apples and everything. But I say all that to set up the fact that from the minute the Department of Homeland Security arrived on the scene, I was very, very concerned because it did not have any of those traditions and it did not have guardrails around it. So what happened is this. The Department of Homeland Security is created in response to the attacks of September 11, 9/11. And it's created in 2003. And it was created under this statement. The mission of the office will be to develop and coordinate the implementation of a comprehensive national strategy to secure the United States from terrorist threats or attacks. The office will coordinate the executive branch's efforts to detect, prepare for, prevent, protect against, respond to, and recover from terrorist attacks within the United States. Well, kind of hard to object to that, right? It sounds like a really good idea. And that's how people interpreted it. Many people interpreted it when it went into effect in 2003. But very quickly, if you remember, under the George W. Bush administration, the administration began to divide America between people who supported George Bush and the terrorists. Now, Bush didn't do that himself at the beginning, if you remember. He talked about it being good to have dissent within the country, but he's changed his tune very quickly. He came to say, either you are with us, as in his administration, or you are with the terrorists. And he began to call America the Homeland. And that was something that raised real concerns for historians of America, because it's the kind of language that right-wing leaders use, the idea that you're creating a militaristic nationalism through words like the homeland. And I've always been leery of that word, even after it went into the common parlance. All right, with that, the new Office of Homeland Security in 2003. Now it's going to become the Department in 2002. It's going to become the Department in 2003 under Congress. Congress turns it into a department in 2003. The new Office of Homeland Security had no congressional oversight when it was first put into effect, and the person put in charge of it, a guy named Tom Ridge, had no experience in either intelligence or in security, but he was somebody with whom George Bush felt comfortable. He was actually Bush's jogging buddy. And he did not have Senate confirmation. So you have here this really hasty construction of this big organization with no congressional input and with no Senate confirmation of the person in charge. All right, so what happened then was that Congress, in the wake of the attacks, had appropriated $40 billion to help American security, and the Bush administration put that money over into the department. It wasn't the department, that was the Office of Homeland Security. And they put in those positions to oversee the Department of Homeland Security fervent supporters of the George W. Bush administration. So very quickly, it became a really political organization. Unlike the military, where if you're in the military, you leave your politics at the door. You serve America, you serve different presidents. It doesn't matter for whom you vote. You are serving the U.S. country and the U.S. Constitution. That was not the case in Homeland Security. All right, so what happened then was that with under Homeland Security, interestingly enough, at the same time that the administration was talking about, the fears of large government, for example, it took the money that was allocated to Homeland Security, and instead of putting that money into, for example, the protection of the Port of New York, which was incredibly vulnerable, they chose not to give that money out at a state or local level, but rather to duplicate the security measures that states and local governments had in place with new federal officers. So interestingly enough, you had a lot of the movement for security away from state and local places into a federal system that was an explicitly political system. All right, so then in 2003, the Congress creates the Department of Homeland Security. It takes the office and makes it a department. And they put together 22 different agencies that previously had sort of been spread around the executive branch together into the Department of Homeland Security, including people like FEMA. And interestingly enough, they tried to take away union rights of about 180,000 US employees when they brought them under Homeland Security, with the argument that unionization would hurt national security. They weren't able to do it, but it was an attempt to do that. And one of the things that they say when they put together the Department of Homeland Security, and when I say they, I keep meaning the administration, is that it's really important for national security for there to be a close cooperation between government and industry, because it's vitally important to protect the nation's infrastructure, from the airline industry, if you remember what happened back then, to the telecommunications industry, to water supplies, to power plants, to bring those private organizations for them to get the backing of the federal government in order to protect national security. And quickly, there comes to be real cooperation between corporations and Homeland Security in the early to mid 2000s. At the same time, as I say, the state and local organizations that have local control can't really get money to do the things that they had been that they needed to do in the wake of 9/11. So what happened from there is that within that absorption of all those new organizations under the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, the Department of Homeland Security absorbed a number of different things, including the U.S. Customs Service and Immigration and Naturalization Services, then at the time known as INS. And it then began to under this umbrella organization, it created a branch known as U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which we now know as ICE. That's what ICE is, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that is a federal law enforcement agency, and it's a federal law enforcement agency in the executive branch under the Department of Homeland Security. So that's what's happening over there. But within ICE, there are two different branches. One of them is called Homeland Security Investigations, and the other one is known as Enforcement and Removal Operations. I guess in a way that doesn't really matter to most people. They just know them all as ICE. But what's important to remember, I guess, is that they do very different things. ERO, as it's known, Enforcement and Removal Operations, is responsible for immigration. But Homeland Security Investigations is actually, a long time ago, I got very into this, long before the Bush administration, because I was really concerned with what their portfolio looked like. Because Homeland Security Investigations has more than 10,000 employees. They're spread around the country in more than 200 cities. They have international offices in 53 countries, and they also have a number, more than 7,000 special agents. And what they are in charge of is investigating anything that might threaten the national security of the United States, which again, bully for them, more power to them. I'm all about, protecting America. But that means that they are supposed to be in charge of counterterrorism, anything to do with human smuggling or human trafficking, weapons, import or export, narcotics, of course, any kind of document fraud or benefit fraud, any kind of identity documents or immigration documents, any human rights violations, any kind of transnational gang activity, financial crimes, money laundering, cash smuggling, cybercrime, sex tourism, child exploitation, any kind of commercial fraud, intellectual property, pharmaceuticals that are counterfeited, any kind of merchandise that's counterfeited, any kind of mass marketing fraud. international cultural property, antiquities crimes, visa security, and art theft. So if you look at that list of what Homeland Security is responsible for, it's really extraordinarily broad. For me, it's always art theft that stops me cold, because I'm certainly not an advocate of art theft, but I'm not entirely clear how art theft intersects with national security. It just seems to me to be a very broad mandate. So what's happening here? By 2018, Homeland Security had a budget of more than $47 billion, more than $47 billion. It had almost 250,000 employees. That's not to say they were all law enforcement officers, of course. Probably most of them were clerks, for all I know. But the point is, this is a really, really big organization. And it is, in fact, the third largest cabinet department after that of Defense, which is the biggest, and Veterans Affairs, which is the second biggest. All right, so why do we care about this? Because it is entirely a political organization. It does not have that tradition, the military tradition of nonpartisanship that the military does. So what's happened under Trump is that the Homeland Security and all the people who are responsible for law enforcement within Homeland Security are political appointees. And at this point, the director of Homeland Security, a man named Chad Wolf, was never confirmed by the U.S. Senate. He is they're in an acting capacity, and in a weird, I would say, loophole in the initial legislation creating the Department of Homeland Security, every other cabinet officer has to be confirmed by the Senate, and you can have an acting cabinet secretary, for 210 days. Until there's a nomination, unless there's a nomination for a permanent one. You can extend it a bit if there's a formal nomination, because the idea of having an acting one was only to tide you over until the president got somebody else that he or she wanted into office. They had to nominate somebody, and you got to do due diligence and look into them. It takes a while to get a cabinet officer through the Senate, so it makes sense that you should be able to have somebody in an acting capacity, but the limit for that is 210 days. Chad Wolf has now been on the job 250 days. And apparently, I mean, it's not entirely clear that this is legal. It may be possible under the 2002 law, the way it was written, which, by the way, I highlighted on Twitter last night if anybody's interested. But the point here is that he does not have a background in intelligence or security, and he's there because he is a Trump loyalist. So what we have is a man in charge of Homeland Security who is there for political reasons, and he is in charge of this very large organization with quite a broad mandate without really any congressional oversight. All right, so why do we care about, or how is this developed? It's not a new thing that the Department of Homeland Security under Donald Trump has taken extraordinary liberties, and it's been a real problem. In April of 2018, actually we learned this through a job advertisement, the Department of Homeland Security began to monitor media, especially journalists and what they called social media influencers, as well as media outlets. They actually began to monitor our journalists and our social media influencers. And when this happened, the website Snopes reached out to them. And by the way, sometimes people say, talk about Snopes having some kind of an ideological leaning. I've had to deal with Snopes on 2 occasions, and they are extraordinarily thorough. So the idea that they're somehow just spouting a party line is, in my experience, absolutely not true. They really are very, very good about chasing down real sources. So Snopes reached out to DHS, and it responded on Twitter. This is in 2018. It said, and I quote, "Despite what some reporters may suggest, this is nothing more than the standard practice of monitoring current events in the media. Any suggestion otherwise is fit for tinfoil hat-wearing, black helicopter conspiracy theorists." But of course, it's not standard practice to observe, to keep lists of who's doing what in the media. It certainly has happened in American politics before, but it's not something that the government is supposed to be doing. So Snopes asked for clarification of how this was standard practice, and DHS again responded on social media, on Twitter, quote, "You are embarrassing yourself with these questions and wild conspiracy theories. Just like you monitored the media to find this story, DHS does the same. Enjoy your weekend." Of course, the difference here is that Snopes is part of the media. The DHS is part of the government, and the government is constrained from observing its citizens in this kind of a way, and certainly of having steps in place to silence the media. All right, so what's happening right now? What's happening right now is that how is the Trump administration going into Portland, Oregon? Because one of the things to remember is that the federal government certainly can go in under certain circumstances, but this is really an unusual use of the law enforcement officers at the disposal of the executive branch, because there really is not anything going on in Portland, Oregon, or in Chicago, or in the other cities that are on the list that the administration says it's going to go into, that are beyond the capabilities of the local and the state governments. And you see this with both the mayors and the senators and the governors saying, we don't want federal troops here. Don't come here. We don't want you. So the argument for why it's important to have troops in Portland, Oregon is under an executive order. Now, again, Trump can issue, and any president can issue executive orders. And what they are is literally the order of, not literally because he's in the government, but think of it as an order from a boss to the people who work for him. That's what an executive order is. It says, this is how I want you to fill the requirements of this particular law. So on June 26th, Trump issued an executive order called, quote, the Executive Order on Protecting American Monuments, Memorials, and Statues. Let me read that again. Executive Order on Protecting American Monuments, Memorials, and Statues and Combating Recent Criminal Violence. All right, so what he's talking about, and what he talks about explicitly in that executive order, is the attacks on Confederate statues, for example, which itself is fascinating because, of course, the Confederacy was in rebellion against the United States government. So the fact that the United States government is now theoretically protecting those statues is itself interesting. But it also, it's a really interesting stand to take for the federal government to take, that it's important enough to protect statues. These are not lives lost. This is not, some of the incredibly violent times we've had in our past. This is to protect minor amounts of property. This is not the firebombing of Tulsa. This is a really limited problem in places like Portland, Oregon. But listen to what the executive order actually said. And I'm going to read a pretty significant portion of it here, because listen to the words he uses. Section 1, the purpose of this. The first duty of government is to ensure domestic tranquility and defend the life, property, and rights of its citizens. Over the last 5 weeks, there has been a sustained assault on the life and property of civilians, law enforcement officers, government property, and revered American monuments such as the Lincoln Memorial. Again, it sounds really awful, but if you remember what happened to the Lincoln Memorial was that there was a little bit of graffiti on the back side. And similarly, while there have been very dangerous assaults on life, they've happened at the hands of police, not the other way around. So it's a really interesting use of language. And some people have written to me and said, well, what about the attack on the protester on the police officer in Portland with a claw hammer, which sounds horrible, right? Well, if you actually read what happened, the protester was trying to break down a glass door. Mind you, that's not necessarily a great thing to do, but he's trying to break down the glass door with a hammer. And when the police officer tried to stop him, he tried to hit the police officer 3 times with the hammer. The police officer broke those blows, and in fact did not sustain any kind of serious injury. At the same time, of course, in Portland, we have had 1 skull fracture, facial reconstruction surgery, a broken hand, and tear gas on the protesters who are, graffitiing and breaking down fences. But again, that's pretty mild stuff, and stuff that has been handled by the local police authorities who continue to say they don't want feds in the area because they're escalating things, deliberately escalating things. All right, so now listen to how it goes on. Many of the rioters, arsonists, and left-wing extremists who have carried out and supported these acts have explicitly identified themselves with ideologies such as Marxism that call for the destruction of the United States system of government. You know, that's a straw man. That's just a straw man. All right. Then, anarchists and left-wing extremists have sought to advance, this is an executive order from the President of the United States. Anarchists and left-wing extremists have sought to advance a fringe ideology that paints the United States of America as fundamentally unjust, and have sought to impose that ideology on Americans through violence and mob intimidation. They're literally referring here, apparently, to the Black Lives Matter movement, which was launched in response to the extrajudicial killings of Black Americans at the hands of police violence. That's hardly left-wing extremism, the idea that we should all have a right to a trial by jury. So that's an interesting one. Then, they have led riots in the streets, burned police vehicles, killed and assaulted government officers, as well as business owners defending their property, and even seized an area within one city where law and order gave way to anarchy. During the unrest, innocent citizens also have been harmed and killed. Again, as a historian, this is government propaganda. This is not what actually happened, or what an impartial look at what's been happening is going to look like. These criminal acts are frequently planned and supported by agitators who have traveled across state lines to promote their own violent agenda. It is very true that people have crossed state lines to go to different protests, but that's even more true on the neo-Nazi side, which again, good people on both sides, right? These radicals shamelessly attack the legitimacy of our institutions and the very rule of law itself. So with this executive order, the U.S. Attorney General Barr put troops from the executive branch into Portland, Oregon to defend public property, federal property, because the Hatfield Courthouse in Portland, Oregon was sustaining damage, and it was sustaining damage of graffiti. There was a broken glass door, and there were significant fireworks fired in the area, including one of them inside the building. Again, an attack on federal property for sure, but one met by law officials in the streets attacking peaceful protesters. And don't make the mistake of thinking this is normal, or that this is an acceptable level of the use of our Homeland Security forces, because they are being turned against American citizens who are engaged in our constitutional right to protest. So that's one piece here. But the next piece is that that fine, if that's what you're going to do in Portland, Oregon, which has, for its own internal reasons, had very sustained attacks. I was thinking that the police have very sustained protests over the last 50-odd days. Oregon is also important here because it has a Democratic mayor, a Democratic governor, and 2 Democratic senators. So Trump has been using that to highlight the idea that somehow Democrats in control of a state and a city are very dangerous to law and order. But we got an issue here for him going into Chicago, because Chicago has not had that kind of sustained protests. So what is the argument for going into Chicago? Well, I don't think it's an accident that the mayor of Chicago is an African-American woman. We all know that Trump has an issue with women in power, and he certainly has an issue with African-American women. So I don't think it's an accident he picked Chicago, but Chicago has also been a straw man on the Fox News circuit, the news channel circuit, for a long time. So it was a pretty logical place for them to go. But they're going into Chicago under a different rule, and that is under an operation launched on July 8th by by the Justice Department. On July 8th, Attorney General Barr announced that announced the launching of what was known as Operation Legend. Which was, as the announcement said, a sustained, systematic, and coordinated law enforcement initiative across all federal law enforcement agencies, working in conjunction with state and local enforcement officials to fight the sudden surge of violent crime beginning in Kansas City, Missouri. It was created as a result of President Trump's promise to assist America's cities that are plagued by recent violence. Now, as I pointed out last night, in fact, there has been a spike in violence in American cities quite recently, but the long-term trends in American cities are for a drastic reduction in violent crime, and you can see the statistics online from the FBI. Operation Legend is named for a 4-year-old child, a young man named, a toddler really at 4, named Legend Taliaferro, who was killed in his sleep. He was shot and killed in his sleep in Kansas City, and they are organizing it around his name. But he goes on to really emphasize that federal agents are going into local areas to combat what they call violence. And violence, I'm sorry, it is violence, but what they call an escalation violence. That is, they are insisting that they will be putting down violent crime. Attorney General Barr, under Operation Legend, he says, directed federal agents from the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, to surge resources to Kansas City in the upcoming weeks to help state and local officials fight the surge of violent crime. They will be working alongside state and local enforcement. So the idea here is to, and at the same time, the U.S. Attorney theoretically will be surging resources to those areas to prosecute violent crime at the same time. So what we have going on here, I think, is an attempt to do 2 things. First of all, to change the narrative away from the coronavirus and racial animosity coming from the administration and its supporters, to insist that Democrats are a threat to American law and order. And they're very clear, and Trump is very clear when he talks on Twitter or when he talks in interviews about how he considers Democrats, that is, the Americans, to be the, if you will, the hordes coming over our borders. That is, Democrats now are a danger to American society, and they need to be put down with federal troops that are controlled only by the executive branch. If that doesn't scare you, it should, because this is a really, really dangerous precedent, and a really, where does this go? So people have asked what one can do about this. Should everyone just get off the streets? What one can do? Here's what I would say. I am not a political organizer, so you should turn to a political organizer first. But I will tell you, going away is exactly the wrong thing, in the sense that it would establish that Trump was a strong figure. It's important to continue to be in the streets, as people are in Portland, but to be there non-violently. One of the things that happens in American protests is that the minute protests become violent, shyer, middle-of-the-road people turn against them. So what the Trump administration is trying to do is to provoke protesters to turn violent. And when they turn violent, Trump can say, "I told you so," and put teeth into what he keeps saying, that the people who support a Democratic candidate, a presumptive Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, are in fact dangerous people. So that's all I have to say about that. And tempted though I am to stop, I think that I'd like to say a little bit more about something else that is being hidden by what is a real attempt to take over U.S., especially Democratic-led cities, and that is Russia. I mean, Jane Allen said, asked if I could address the question about how did Republicans go from being against the Soviets and Russians to currently aiding and abetting them and their intrusions into today's political world. And Deb Thalassitis said, what's going on between Biden's statement yesterday that foreign governments were interfering in our elections and that the gang of 4 Democrats, the leadership 4 Democrats on the Gang of 8 has requested that the FBI brief the entire House and Senate on interference at this time. What's going on? Really good question. Important that Joe Biden, of course, is now apparently receiving intelligence briefings. So he is kind of a window into what we have not been able to see for a number of years. And there is no doubt that there is interference in our political discourse coming from foreign actors, malevolent foreign actors. And that obviously top of the list is Russia, but they're not the only ones, because Citizens United and because the Trump administration has thrown the door open for people to go ahead and try to convince American voters to support Trump, but more than that, to give up on democracy, to say that democracy doesn't matter anymore because nobody tells the truth, and really it doesn't matter who leads us. That's disinformation. That constant harping, the constant barrage, the constant stories that you don't know what to make of, that is a form of foreign disinformation designed to create chaos, even more than it is to support one side or another. So how did the Republican Party get to this? The Republican Party got here in a really interesting way, because you're dead right, that Jane is dead right, that the Republicans had taken a really strong stand against Russia. So what the heck happened in 2016? Well, I'm going to go back a little bit here, and I'm going to probably do this quicker than you would like me to, because something really important happened in the 2016 election, and I feel like we don't write it down and don't put it in order enough. And so going into the 2016 election, Republicans are actually in the forefront, although certainly the Obama administration is right out there, on calling out Russia for its attacks on Ukraine, because Russia invades Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 2014. And when it does that, it becomes a real international pariah, and it gets kicked out, for example, of the Gang of 8, the G8, which is an organization of theoretically the largest economies in the world. Russia was not one of the largest economies in the world, but they had been invited to participate in the G8. They got kicked out, and that's why it's now the G7. But in addition to that problem, the Obama administration, with the support of Congress, the Republicans in Congress, put a number of economic sanctions on certain companies and certain oligarchs in the Russian sphere. And that's how things looked, and going into the election of 2016. So what happened? Let me break it down for you a little bit. On June 9th, 2016, Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner met with a Russian lawyer, and she's also a political operative, a woman named Natalia, and I'm so sorry about my pronunciation of Russian, Veselnitskaya, there we go, and several other people in Trump Tower. That's the famous Trump Tower meeting. And Don Jr. later claimed that this was about adoptions. But what that meant was it was about sanctions, because in retaliation for the sanctions, Russians stopped American adoptions. So they have this meeting. And it later became clear that what they're really talking about is removing those sanctions that had been so crippling to the Russian oligarchs after 2014. In that, we know now, thanks to the notes that were kept by Paul Manafort's, one of his right-hand guys, a guy named Gates, who actually flipped on him, and started cooperating with the Mueller investigation. In his notes, he said that what was discussed was, and this is in his shorthand, foreign contributions, I hope you don't mind me fleshing that out, to campaign, and CF, probably Clinton Foundation, brought up at June 9 meeting, emails and CF contribution focus on what Kant could use. Priority, opposition items. They're looking for opposition items on Hillary Clinton in exchange for changing American approaches to sanctions. All right. 3 days later, on June 12th, Julian Assange tweeted that Wikileaks, he's the head of Wikileaks, had damaging information on Hillary Clinton and would release it. And then Gates also told Mueller, quote, the RNC also indicated they knew the timing of the upcoming releases. Okay, so why is that a real issue? The real issue is the fact that we now know that the hacks into the DNC, and by the way, there were also hacks into the RNC, we know because Lindsey Graham said so on the record. Those hacks we now know were executed by the Russian military's intelligence branch, the GRU. So the Russian military got these emails by hacking them and is going to distribute them through WikiLeaks. All right, so that's interesting that Gates said that. Why did the Republican National Committee know that? That was a lot. That was in the Mueller report. So what's happening now? You asked about the Russian switch, and I'm afraid I'm going to go over a few minutes, but I will try to be as quick as I can. I mentioned Paul Manafort before. Who the heck is Paul Manafort? Paul Manafort then is going to become Trump's campaign chairman on June 20th. Manafort had been an associate, he was actually a Richard Nixon guy, but he was a political associate of Roger Stone. And the two of them had a political consulting business. And Manafort had gone on to advise the campaign, the presidential campaign of Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine from 2004 to 2010. And while he was doing that, he was warned by the U.S. ambassador at the time, William Taylor, you may remember him from the testimony during the Ukraine scandal, had actually warned him that he had to stop it because he was hurting American interests in Ukraine because the guy he was working for, Yanukovych, was too closely tied to Russian President Vladimir Putin. So essentially, you've got Manafort working for a guy who is close to Putin. All right. When Yanukovych wins the presidency of Ukraine in 2010, Manafort begins a number of investment projects with a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska and another oligarch, Ukrainian oligarch named Dmytro Firtash, names you might have heard, Deripaska and Firtash. And he made tens of millions of dollars working with these guys, but he also owed them millions of dollars as well. He was pretty tightly tied to them. And when protesters force Yanukovych out of Ukraine in 2014, he actually flees to Russia and he takes shelter with Vladimir Putin. And when that happens, the FBI begins to investigate Manafort. Now, that's one of those earlier investigations that Donald Trump now says, oh, they were investigating my campaign. They're investigating Manafort because he had worked with Yanukovych, who was a crony of Vladimir Putin. All right. So after that, Manafort began to work with Yanukovych's successor, a guy who was trying to take his place. And in December 2015, records showed that Manafort was in debt for about $17 million to people who are close to both Putin and Yanukovych. And so he's in debt to these guys. And he doesn't really have a way to make the money back because his folks are no longer in power in Ukraine. And he's got the problem of the sanctions as well. So on June 20th, Manafort becomes the chair of the Donald Trump campaign. And he goes to work for Donald Trump for free. That's interesting itself. All right, so you asked when the change happens. The Republican National Committee met in Cleveland in 2016 on July 18th, from July 18th to July 21st of 2016. And interestingly enough, there was a platform change in a plank of the platform, really quite unexpected. And that platform change was this. The plank change was this. The Republican platform had strongly supported Ukraine's effort to throw Russia out of Crimea and to return Ukraine to its previously pro-Europe, pro-democratic government and orientation. And that plank gets switched during the RNC to water it down, to say that the Republican Party does not necessarily support Ukraine's military actions against Russia and Vladimir Putin. So I'm going to, I'd love to finish this here, and if you're interested, I will tell you more about how this happened. But I kind of like a I kind of like to keep to the hour here just because I know people plan around this. So if you would like to know more about how that plank got changed and Republican attitudes toward Russia changed was in that plank of the Republican platform in 2016. But then, of course, we currently have the fact that President Trump has never, for all that he has taken on virtually all of our allies, he has never said a negative word about Vladimir Putin. And that's a really interesting thing because right now we are looking at the Russia bounty scandal, which is itself a tremendous scandal. The idea that Russians offered money for attacks, for killing of American forces and allied forces in Afghanistan. And Trump has simply blew that off. First he said it didn't matter, it wasn't true, that he didn't hear about it. Then he said it wasn't true. And now it's sort of been swept under the rug, but that is a huge scandal. And of course, within the last week, we have gotten the news that Russians tried to hack into our medical systems to steal our information about fighting coronavirus. Again, not a peep out of the administration. And there's a lot more to say, of course, about that, but the influence of Paul Manafort on this campaign is on Trump's 2016 campaign. And remember, it was Manafort who turned a dying campaign around. He brought a lot of money and a lot of energy and a really new orientation to that campaign in the summer of 2016 after he became campaign chair on June 20th. And I think his past really matters in this, and his ties to the issues involved with Russia. All right. So I'm going to call it quits there because I'm tired. That's enough on this. I find the whole Russia stuff absolutely fascinating. Have followed it from the minute it first appeared, because when I saw the change in the plank on that day, my eyes perked right up and I went, boy, something's going on. And so I've been paying attention ever since then, about 4 years ago, right at this very moment. All right, I'm going to call it quits for the day. I hope to see you here on Thursday when I talk about the history of the Republican Party from before this moment, back when it was doing something very different. That's at, not at 4 o'clock, at 1 o'clock on Thursday. Again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a history professor, and I do not speak for my employer when I do these. Thanks a lot for being here, and with luck, I'll see you on Thursday.